Welcome to Dynamics of Dialogue. This is your host, Ty Davis, and I wanted to dedicate this month's episodes to a cause that is very special to me. This month, we're focusing on sexual assault and domestic violence awareness. Stay tuned after the episode for details on where you can get help if this is you.
Welcome to Dynamics of Dialogue. Today, I am your guest host. My name is TeKesha Smith, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I have the privilege of interviewing our host, Ty Davis.
Hey, yes.
Welcome.
Yes.
Welcome. This is fun. This is new to me, but I am going to enjoy this journey.
All right. I plan on enjoying it. Thank you for coming on and doing this with me, because I couldn't think of a better person to host this episode and interview me than you.
So today we're going to be talking about transgenerational trauma. And one of the things I like to lead in with first is, just so everybody's clear and we're all on the same page, just defining what transgenerational trauma is, examples of what that looks like, how it comes about, what behaviors or sometimes what we may classify as symptoms present. So transgenerational trauma is trauma that is transferred from the first generation or one generation of trauma survivors to a second or another or further generations of offspring of the survivors via complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, I know that was a lot, but just think about that for a minute. So basically what that looks like is slavery is a good example of transgenerational trauma.
Right.
Okay, and how that looks is maybe my children or myself being fearful, hesitant of white people and understanding where that comes from. Well, my ancestors were enslaved and they suffered some trauma from behind that. Well, trauma is something that impacts you mentally, physically, and emotionally, and studies have been proven to show that trauma changes your psychopathology. Therefore, it changes the chemical balances in your body. That's hereditary. That can be genetic. Yes. That then passes along to someone like myself, and I grow up being hesitant around white people. Having a loss of a child can be an example of transgenerational trauma. Being abused, whether it be mentally, emotionally, sexually, physically, can create transgenerational trauma. And what some of the behaviors that manifest from that is, like I said, hesitation, maybe anxiety, depression, isolation. Some research have even associated that with schizophrenia. Yes. So these are just some of the things that I'd like for our listeners to consider and keep in mind when we are talking about transgenerational trauma. And one of the reasons why I'm interviewing you today is that it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And it's important that people have a safe space to tell their story.
Yes. For me, this transgenerational, intergenerational trauma, I want to talk about, highlight. Yeah, there's a physical component, right? Physiological, like you said. It alters your brain matter. It alters your chemistry. It alters your DNA. And then so it's passed down in that regard. And then also the other way that it's passed down is through our behavior, our learned behaviors about what we believe is right. And again, to go back to the point that you made about slavery, I'll use the perfect example of spankings and whippings. In our community, we believe that spankings and whippings are okay, and that it's a normal part, and it's not just the black community, it's Southern culture, it's, lots
it's
of
acceptable.
Pockets. It's acceptable, right? But at the same token, what we're not looking at is, we're looking at whole groups of people, generations of people who can, joke about, well, I got hit with a cast iron frying pan. Oh, well, my mom, she grab this baseball bat or a broomstick. I had to go pull off a switch off a tree. I mean, this is really abusive stuff.
It's minimized to jokes.
We're minimizing it to jokes and talking about it, So for me, I am a survivor of intergenerational trauma. And the type of trauma I'm talking about is not just, I've been beat with an extension cord before. I know how many kids have been.
Many people can relate to that.
Yeah.
And children.
But that, I mean, it just, I had to pause even saying that out loud because that's it. I'm at 48. I remember what that was like.
Because that was traumatic.
It's very
and
traumatic.
And our brain does store trauma.
Yeah, it is. For me, gosh, the part is sexual, physical abuse.
That
holding space for all the people, because really what I'm talking about is some core members of my family.
Okay.
And so it's always hard because, on one hand, the abuse that happened and it did alter my life. It altered me as a person, and I had to learn how to undo those things. But on the other hand, I'm holding space for the fact that they're victims as well.
Absolutely.
So my
can you talk? I'm sorry. Can you talk about some of the things that you're able to recognize? You notice that were altered. You talked about how it altered your behavior. It altered how you operated. What does that look like?
As a child, I was very. I was a tomboy. I was very free spirited. I was a baby girl with 2 older brothers. So I was the one that, I used to love to ride around on my brother's skateboard, play with their racing cars. I mean, I was just free. I felt very free. And, over the years, as those experiences began to happen between the physical abuse, the yelling, the beatings, and the beatings were significant.
Okay.
They were significant, like the type of thing where, my dad would have us strip us down, make us take our clothes off, tie our hands behind our back, and we'd have to bend over the couch, and he'd beat us all at the same time. That is just kind of really stuck in my head. So for me, when it went from yelling to it was happening to my brothers, and then it started happening to me too, it's like I wasn't free anymore.
Right.
I couldn't. I just kind of retreated inward.
Right. Right.
These are the ways as I can look back now as an adult and see how I retreated into myself. I started writing.
Okay.
To cope with it. I started, doing puppet shows with my little stuffed animals. They were my security.
Right.
They were my comfort.
Okay.
So I became really introverted and creative.
Okay.
To cope with it, and I didn't feel so much as free.
So you went from what I'm hearing is that you went from being a tomboy, as you described, just free-spirited, energetic, open child to, as you described or state, an introvert. You begin to kind of isolate yourself, and you turn inward, and you begin to journal. You begin to write.
I began to write.
And so you socialized less, but there was an obvious change in your behavior.
I would, to look back at it now, I can see it. I can see there was an obvious change in my behavior. Because like I said, I was the type of kid, I'd go outside and I'd spend all my time around my brothers, catching lightning bugs, and pulling the lights out and putting them in jars, little things like, I was a kid that was an explorer. And so there was definitely a time where things got worse, and I really just went inward and into myself. And the difference is that normally I think parents would notice that, but again, holding space for my parents' experience, which it's hard to talk about, and I know somebody's got to be saying, well, gosh, where's her parents? Where's her mother? Where all this is going on.
And where was your mom?
She was there. She was there, and so she was aware in part of some of what was happening. And this is hard for me to sit with because I just recently learned that. That's part of the challenge too. People think that with trauma, it's you can name everything and you know what it is and you're angry and no. For me, I knew that this was my life. I lived it, but I didn't understand that this was trauma. I had been through traumatic experiences, and some of that involved neglect.
Right.
I didn't have this understanding until I was like 37, maybe 11 years ago.
And that's normal. Most people don't have an understanding. Most of us are not able to recognize it because, as we said early, it's so culturally accepted within society that we don't realize it until something major happens or we have a break ourselves to bring it to the forefront. Right. And as young children, you don't have the vernacular to say it, and most children are not empowered to say it or don't have a safe space. If you're already in an abusive situation, where's that safe space to express that?
Right.
So that's understandable.
And the other thing is, in particular, having the safe space to be heard and to be believed, because lots of times when we do tell that things are happening, we're not believed or we're blamed for it happening. That's what happened to me. Not the first time it happened, but the first time when I told, I wasn't believed. It was thought that I was, being used as a pawn in a divorce. So this whole story about what happened to me got overlooked and lost inside of an argument about two people getting a divorce.
Right.
And
that was trauma within itself. I just need for people to understand how profound trauma is, and in a way that of how it touches on every component in relationships and every behaviors that are manifested. And even the two individuals that are going through that divorce, there is trauma. There is trauma individually, not just even from that situation, but even prior to that.
There is, so now I'm glad I got that little break because it is profound to be it as an adult. We talk about trauma not because childhood trauma, not because it's people just holding on to the past. These are beliefs about yourself,
right?
Beliefs that you have about other people in life because of how you were taught, in your formative years. So for me, in my formative years, the people that I trusted the most were abusing me. Now, how confusing is that?
That's extremely confusing. It's the same thing with slavery. The person who I trusted the most, which was my grandmother, had firsthand experience of being enslaved. So if that's where my knowledge and information, that's my information source is coming from, and my own and everybody else, that's your perception. It shapes everything, and it was the same thing for your trauma.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know more about, just a little bit more about, even now I'm noticing a pause. But it's important that as we explore trauma, that we acknowledge what we're feeling, even discussing it. So just briefly tell me what you're feeling.
Even now, there's always a tug about being a writer and breaking free of the stigma and telling the story. Telling the story helps because it's lending a perspective. The silence hushes a perspective about what happened to a person that has been through trauma. And when we silence those perspectives, then people don't really understand what it really looks like. So for me, that is important to me. It has been important to me for my healing. But I still struggle with, this is my family. How do people respond to, okay, well, your parents abused you, get over it. And the challenge is that, it's not even so much of how the abuse happened. it's that the abusive patterns of behavior continue
Right.
long after the physical abuse.
It doesn't just stop.
Right. And so for my parents, it's like there's really not an awareness. So it's not like I'm saying I'm letting them off the hook or whatever, but I'm holding space for them because I don't want the world to think they're horrible people, right? Because they're not. But at the same time, I just don't have the relationship with them that I would like to or should or, could because of these continued patterns of behavior. And I think pretty much just to encapsulate it, in our community, we raise our children. It's almost like in the black community, in our generation and above, it's different now.
Right.
But years, prior, we don't look at children as people. They're objects, they're possessions.
They're to be seen, feelings. Not heard.
Right. They don't. They're not to be. They're not to their opinion. If they speak, they're being grown. They're
out of
not
order.
People. They're not supposed to have thoughts, feelings, and opinions. And for a lot of adult parents that are, baby boomers, right? They still have that attitude towards their adult children. You don't have
very much so.
You don't have You
don't have an opinion. You don't.
Right.
You don't have a right to feel this way. And that's let me just say this. The reason why I asked that question about what you were feeling was I think it's important for our listeners to hear and understand how difficult it is for you to even, and survivors to even tell their stories and what they experienced just telling the story. Imagine sitting with it in silence and not having a safe space to ever tell your story.
Because people say, well, why tell the story? Because again, people don't understand. I may be a person that especially if you're a man, majority of the trauma that happened to me happened by a man. So I don't like to be roughhoused.
Right.
I don't like, but for some men, that's how they feel like they want to express affection. But I have to be able to articulate to you, I don't like that. And if I articulate it, it can't be a problem because that's what you want. It has to be an understanding that this is something that it makes me uncomfortable. And the reason may not resonate with you. You may not understand it, but still respect that I'm another person. You know what I mean? So it
makes sense to I guess to those people I would say, well, why not tell the story? Because if we are a culture moving towards breaking and disrupting negative cycles and patterns of abuse and toxic energy in relationships and bad habits, the way you do that is by speaking. It's by telling the stories. You have to be able to identify how it starts, where it begins, what it looks like. If that's the goal, and I'm thinking for us as a culture and a society, we need some healing, and that's where healing begins.
It's where healing, because see, for me now again, I had this major episode back in 2007, right, and that's when I stopped working. I was, so for me, yes, I lived that life, but again, there's all kinds of ways that our mind uses to escape from things like that. So it's kind of like, here I am, I'm working, have this great career in IT. I'm a business analyst on a process engineering team. I'm cruising along. Next thing I know, all hell breaks loose and I can't even function anymore. I couldn't eat. I lost 80 pounds. I couldn't think straight. I was hearing things. I was seeing things, and it turns out this is PTSD. Somebody had tried to tell me that I had PTSD before, and I was like, I don't have no PTSD. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that whole ain't nothing wrong with me. Right, nothing wrong with them.
Yeah, nothing's wrong. Right. But then sure enough, I'm in the middle of it happening, and I'm observing this happening to me. I'm having I thought they were memories.
You were having flashbacks.
They were flashbacks.
What we call flashbacks.
Right, because these were things that actually happened. These are not things that never happened that I'm afraid of. These are things that I actually witnessed.
Right. So it was an actual, just for clarification, that's what we call flashbacks. It's a symptom of PTSD and not a hallucination. And because it was very, very real. And it did happen.
Yes.
Yep. And that is a typical symptom of PTSD. But okay. I'm sorry.
It is, yeah. And so, so for me, the challenge is is, so we have this way of being, right? And understanding that, lived this life, I wasn't even present to, I didn't, even though it was my life, I didn't really understand that until I had gone to see a psychiatrist.
Okay.
The psychiatrist listed the things that I had experienced as neglect. I had never even heard, I didn't even know that in reference to me, hearing that word as an adult, that these things happen because of neglect and the abuse and so on and so forth. It was a lot. It was a lot.
Because nobody wants to believe that about their parents and their families and everything. That's hard to hear.
It's hard to hear. You don't want to believe that about your family. So for me, it's only been since this whole episode happened, it's only been the past 11 years that I've actually been able to be present to the trauma, been able to remember some of the trauma and understand actually what happened. So although, in my brain, these were things that were normalized prior to that point, only in the past 11 years did I realize that one of these offenders was a family member, and that when he did it to another family member, they told and they weren't believed, and nothing happened. And so this same person went on doing it to all these other people in the family.
And that's typically what happens.
And because nobody ever said anything. And I'm like, well, how? So to understand, like, at this point, and look back at the carnage and to look back and say, oh my God, this is what all these things were, and understand it. It's massively impactful. And so, it creates a different experience, and it's isolating. I think that's why the need to tell the story becomes greater, because then we realize when we tell the story, there's so many people just like us.
I think more people than what we know are just like, have experienced trauma. And it's important for people to understand and know that the issues that we try to avoid or we refuse to discuss today only becomes our reality tomorrow. It continues. That's that manifestation. So you can't not talk about it. I understand it may be difficult to hear. I understand it may be uncomfortable, but that's where growth arises from. And positive change is, let's talk about it. And talking about it looks like listening. Another person listening to the story. It's not to be debated, because debating really does not heal. It's not a part of the healing process. We don't incorporate that in the healing process because it's a non-factor. It's not necessary. But I do think it's important for you to continue to tell your story, especially to those that are supportive, those that are willing to listen. And you mentioned that in telling your story, that there were people who didn't believe you.
Yeah, there, and that's hard, not only were there people that didn't believe me, but then I discovered it was like common knowledge. Other people in the family knew that this was happening, not just to me, but, a lot of the trauma I experienced, was witnessing what happened to my brothers. I've seen my brother passed away in 2015. I watched him get thrown down a flight of stairs.
Oh, wow.
I've had experiences where coming to understand it just kind of took me back, thinking about some of these things that we went through. The PTSD comes in when you have a fear of a loss of life. And, I will say that, I can say that my father he was known for being a pretty tough guy,
Okay.
And it was what that really brought up for me was really understanding that this abuse was happening, and there were people that knew about it, family members that knew, and nobody did anything. And that's the thing that is, I carry that as I watched my oldest brother go through addiction,
You see the manifestations of being silent when people knew and they did nothing. Right. And that's, unfortunately, that is a common theme that personally and professionally I hear often. People will bear witness to trauma or abuse
because they don't recognize it as trauma. Even in the case with me, after I had recalled this scenario, remembering my brother being thrown down a flight of stairs. This is in the projects. So this is concrete staircase, stairwell.
So you witnessed him being thrown down, and someone
a whole flight of stairs, yeah.
Literally, and when he was thrown down these flight of stairs, what was his disposition? What did you take me back to?
He was on the ground, just like in disbelief. My mom went running down to pick him up. They ran and got off in the car and left me there with my dad. I got left when a lot of those things were happening because my older brothers were the focus at the time. I got left behind. So just subject to whatever residual was left. Even in New Jersey, in Georgia it's DFACS, in Jersey it's DIFAS. After that incident, because I believe his wrist had been broken that time when he got thrown down the steps. Something got broken that time, and so in the hospital, that's where they called DIFAS, and DIFAS came and took my brother, but then they left me.
Wow.
They left me. I mean, this is the institution that's responsible for
ensuring the safety,
kids.
Health, and well-being of children.
They knew there was, if I'm sure part of that investigation, they can track the calls to law enforcement and, when the kids have been engaged, and they can see that. And, so at the very minimum, they knew they just got my brother. Why did they leave me?
So not only the individuals who you consider to be reliable sources, but now this entity, this agency who was supposed to be there to protect you, have all fallen through the cracks.
It all fell through the cracks. And what that did is that created in me a lot of resentment, a lot of hopelessness, a lot of value. You feel like, how do you find value in yourself as a human being? Or how do you find value in your life when your parents don't protect you? The people pretty much, there's only one relative in my immediate family, my core, between my siblings and my parents that didn't hurt me, and so when everybody else, how
do you build relationships with people? How do you build
healthy relationships with people? And how do you, how can you interact with people in healthy ways when you're just taught that nope, you can't trust anybody, but it was having my son, watching him go through his own set of challenges that made me recognize the need for recovery.
Okay.
Because I didn't understand, this whole breakdown happened when he was going through some difficulties in school, but I really didn't see that need until I saw I needed to change and acknowledge areas in my own way of being for him. And as I began to dig into those places, I began to understand the roots of my trauma and why it was necessary for me to recover and heal.
And describe for our listeners, or talk to our listeners, or people listening, even for me, when did you first realize, hold up, something's got to change? And what did that process look like?
For me, I would say the first thing that really made me realize something had to change was dealing with women in my sorority.
Okay.
Because it kept getting perpetuated, like, well, she's got problems with, everybody has problems with her, so it's got to be her. Then I realized what it was is there's a way of being that lots of us adopt as normal. That's very toxic.
Toxicity is normalized in a lot of families.
Yeah. So I had to realize. So I had, in order, and recognizing the difficulties, the sensitivities I had when dealing with other people.
Okay.
Why I feel a level of betrayal so much more deeply than someone else.
So a sense of hypersensitivity and
Yes.
hypervigilance. So all of that are symptoms as well of PTSD
Yes.
and trauma.
Yes, I had to realize that. So I had to realize, as I recognize, this is not a me versus them thing. This is partially cultural, how we interact with each other culturally, because there are lots of people who will tell you right now the best way to discipline your kid is with a belt, or that kid needs a beating. We all know that doesn't work.
Right.
It just doesn't work.
Right. You could be further traumatizing your child instead of finding out
what the
why.
Is.
Yeah. What's the cause of the behavior?
What's the cause of the behavior? Because I had to go back and recognize there were areas in my own son's life,
Right.
So yeah, it gets to be a big kind of challenge to cope with. But one of the things that helped me was actually working in mental health.
Okay.
That helped me because it was then that I got, although I'd had years of therapy, I'd been to church. Did that.
So you went to therapy, you went to church. So is that where the process began, with church and therapy?
I wouldn't even say the process hadn't begun then, because I was just continuously re-traumatized in those environments.
Okay.
In the church, I was othered because I asked questions. Apparently, that gets me in a lot of trouble in a lot of places. I'm always the one that asks the wrong question. So, that kind of thing. But none of that was healing. I didn't begin to find a place until I actually became a CPS.
Okay.
I got trained as a certified peer specialist.
Okay.
And that's a person that is living with a mental health diagnosis and that has made their way into recovery.
Okay.
And recovery from trauma is different than recovery from substance abuse.
Absolutely.
Right? Because, not to say that there's not addictive behaviors, because I think for me, ice cream, food, and not to minimize, because really anything you can be
right.
It just depends on what's going to be what's harmful to you.
Right, and anything in excess can be harmful, whether it be shopping, socializing, those types of things. And there's always, when speaking of addiction, there's always a, professionally speaking, a mental health diagnosis are typically associated with addiction, because that's just the manifestation of the trauma that they've endured. But you can have or be experiencing trauma or PTSD and not have a substance abuse diagnosis.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so I was just making that distinction that I do not have that, not for the purpose of othering people with substance abuse issues. No. Because again, I feel like every single person that's made it, I'm cheering for you, because
absolutely.
I have a loved one that
in any area of recovery. It's just make sure as we move forward, we properly inform people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So and I'm bringing that up because again, and particularly in Georgia, when we talk about recovery, it's always framed under substance abuse, and we don't really discuss or even give any real credence to what recovery from trauma looks like, and a lot of that had to do with just accepting the things who I became as a result of that trauma. I think a lot of it was not liking who I was. Imagine having to develop real survival skills, at 6. It makes you a more advanced thinker. A lot of times kids like that will probably get billed as grown and, bad mouth and fast and trouble, that kind of thing. So there's so much in that. So to talk about some of the things that I did for healing and recovery, one of the things I did was getting a life coach.
Okay.
I've had a therapist, like I said, at the church, but having a life coach, this type of work was. Adria Kitchens, she is a certified feminine power life coach, and it's transformational in that it challenges your core belief systems about life and about yourself, And so when you begin to challenge that core belief system, that's where you have the opportunity to go back in and reparent yourself. That's what I did. So it's a lot of internal work. I had to go back and reparent and be the parent that I needed for that inner child. You know, so the connection is that people always say, okay, that's childhood trauma, let it go. But really, in reality, you know, lots of times we say that we see these adults acting like children. It's because we have this wounded inner child component that we don't acknowledge, and it doesn't go away.
No,
right?
It stunts your development.
It steers pretty much everything you do. It doesn't really go away.
No.
That inner child is really the evil Kermit sitting on your shoulder, telling you, you know. So and so part of growth and development is going back and healing that inner child. And that creates a better sense of self-love, a better relationship with yourself. The practices that I've engaged in to do that is meditation. I can't begin to tell you. I don't meditate with guided meditation because the talking irritates me.
Right.
I use the binaural beats, the sound, just because I already have racing thoughts.
Right.
Again, why do I have racing thoughts? Well, you know, think about it. From the time I'm 6 years old, I'm strategizing ways to avoid getting physically harmed. You know, or sexually harmed.
You've been stressed.
I've been stressed and strategizing all of that time. So of course, you know that. So in my mind now, it's just the way my mind works.
Right.
But I learned that I can bring that into, you know, calm it down with meditation. You know, I burn sage. I have some right here, some lavender sage, and this is cedar sage. I have, not white sage, for all the activists out there. And another thing I do is use crystals, because I believe, you know, well, stones itself, I believe in having a grounding. You talked earlier about dissociation.
Right.
When I'm feeling like I'm not connected to myself, I have this stone right here. I know everybody can't see it, but TeKesha can. And it's a grounding. You know, you hold it, and it helps me stay present. That's what crystals do. And then there's different types of crystals that carry different types of energy, and should anybody choose, you know.
So it sounds like you found ways to, and it is a form of therapy that we use.
It is, and
it's incorporated often with meditation, but it's called mindfulness. So what it sounds like you've learned how to do is be where your feet are, to be able to center yourself. Yes. And focus on where you are in that moment and enjoying that moment. And enjoying that moment. And what's beautiful about it is through that practice, you have the ability from within to get there.
Yes.
Because that's not where you start, but it's where you end up.
Right.
Which is enjoying in that moment. But that's through, you said, meditation. You know,
meditation, particularly with binaural beats, with the sounds. Because there's different waves lengths of sound that can affect different areas of your brain.
Right.
So that I find to be very relaxing. Burning the sage, and again, I mean, I do engage in prayer, but I find myself being more intentional.
Okay.
So again, it's like what you said, being mindful, right? Because when I set my intentions for what I want, because I'm now connected to that part of myself, then I'm able to bring to pass what I'm looking for.
Right.
So whether it's like in my business, in the podcast, I set the intention to grow and to, you know, improve the image by X, Y, Z. And so I line myself up to do those things, and I'm being intentional about how I spend my time.
Absolutely.
About how I make decisions, about, you know, so I find that is also very helpful towards my recovery, because now I'm doing what makes me happy.
Right.
I'm doing, and I'm gaining success in that area. Again, partially just talking about the message and spreading the word, because again, it's just about people understanding. How many people that have this experience or that connected with it that are willing to share? That's what CPSs do. That's part of what peers do, is share those experiences and say, this is what it's like. And that's my hope, for people to understand what it's like, so that people that are living with this can see themselves in it and so choose to get help. It may not be, you know, professional help, you know, it may not be clinician, because some people just, you know, have concerns about that. But
and justifiable concerns. So I do want to
Yeah.
give people permission to heal wherever you find it.
Yes.
And healing, as long as you are healing, and that may not be with the clinician, that may not be with a pastor or a reverend or a first lady, but find somewhere, somehow, some space to heal.
Yes. Yes. And usually, I think for a lot of people, it's in the form of expression.
It is.
In the form of, and that's the other reason why I created the official DFV podcast community.
Okay.
For creators and entrepreneurs, because that's the place, I realize that I'm healing. I realize that I have certain sensibilities. Integrity in interacting with people is important to me. So that's why I want to build, I don't want a community where everybody's just like, oh, it's all about me. I can do what I want to do.
Right.
Yeah, that's not helpful, because you're not thinking about other people, the experience that you create for people around you. That's where I have a podcast community, officialdfd.com. I invite you all to come check it out. Again, please just come and check it out, because again, it's a place where we're all connecting, bonding, growing,
right,
for this whole purpose. And I think there's a whole lot of powerful things that can come out of a bunch of creative people that are entrepreneur minded coming together in one place.
And in saying that, I want to wrap up. And before I wrap up, or as I wrap up, I want to encourage people to begin their journey of healing. And the way, a particular way that you can begin that journey in healing is to simply start with forgiving. Forgiving yourself, forgiving anyone who's caused you pain or harm. Forgiving is not forgetting, but it allows you the power to heal your body, mind, and spirit. And it opens up a pathway to a new place of peace.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So,
and before we go, I just would like to let everybody know, so my book is out.
Yes.
I'm releasing my book, Mindfulness times 21, in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And this is pretty much bits and pieces of my story of recovery, understanding. It starts out with, it's in sections, the trials of becoming. There should be a manual for this stuff. And it kind of goes into my experience with, being a rebel. So there's poetry, and then all the way, it takes you all the way into my progression of healing and understanding, ending with the Queen. So I'm hoping that you all check it out. You can purchase that book at www.healswithherpen.com. Once again, that's healswithherpen.com. And also, I'm in a poetic anthology. It's a book of 20 of Atlanta's hottest lady poets.
Nice.
Talking about all kinds of issues relating to womanhood, black womanhood, power, all of that. It's beautiful.
And Heals with Her Pen is HEALS.
S, yes. Heals with an S. Healswithherpen.com.
Okay.
Books are available today, so please check me out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Take this information back. Remember, we're closing out Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I want you all to know to pay attention, look around. There's ways to
speak, do something,
If you see
protect,
something, say something.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you are a person who's living with sexual trauma in your life or any kind of trauma, just know that you're not alone. So, on that note, be intentional with your plans and manifest your best. See you next week.
Sean.
Thank you for listening to the show. We hope you found the information to be very helpful to you. If you are in fact living with domestic or sexual assault violence in any form, I encourage you to reach out to RAIN at RAIN.org. There you can find a live chat with someone, or you can call the number 1-800-656-HOPE. That is 1-800-656-4673. Whatever you do, I encourage you to get help today, and I want you to know that you are not alone.